For stuff not on the agenda, Mr. Seria.
Thank you, Chair. There is no public comment submitted today.
Thank you very much. Anything to add or withdraw from the agenda or reorder? Hearing none, we'll move on to item 5, regular agenda, which is overview of year ahead resource adequacy filing.
That will be John from Pacific Energy Advisors. I see you on there, John.
Right, and this is John. Good afternoon. So just a little bit of a heads up to the filing that SDCP needs to make on October 31st. This relates to the resource adequacy program, so that the year ahead requirements to have capacity in place to serve the planned loads of SDCP. So if we can advance the deck here, I'll just kind of walk through a little bit of review. You know, the primary reliability program for California is done through the resource adequacy program, and this it's administered by, it's kind of a multi-agency deal where the California Independent System Operator has reliability requirements, and the California Public Utilities Commission really administers the resource adequacy obligations for load serving entities other than the municipal utilities. So CCAs fall into that. Of course, SDCP falls into that, as would San Diego Gas and Electric as a load serving entity. The basic requirement is that LSEs have to have generation capacity under contract or generally controlled, to be owned or contracted, to meet their expected monthly peak demands, plus a reserve margin of 15%. There's a requirement for a certain portion of that capacity needs to be sited within local reliability areas. In our case here, it's the SD San Diego - Imperial Valley local reliability area, and a certain portion of the capacity has to have certain dispatchability characteristics called flexible RA, able to more or less ramp up and down as needed to contribute to reliability. And one thing that's really important to just keep in mind, this is purely a capacity program. So the contracts that SDCP is entered into do not convey any energy. The power does not show up on through the power source disclosure program on the power content label. So there's a little bit of a bifurcated regime here, where we have energy contracts, and that's sort of what is renewable and communicated to customers, a certain percentage per policy. And then we have the RA program, where the energy is completely separate and removed from that. And purely all you have is capacity to meet reliability obligations. So a lot of that's going to be natural gas, as we'll kind of go through this, and I'll explain the reasons why that's the case. We can.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
John, I have a couple questions though. So as far as the LSE's reliability obligations, do we expect those, in light of the recent fires and then the rolling blackouts this summer, do we expect that to change at all? I mean, I think that there was some discussion about that from the governor. So what do you think, John?
I think it's likely. It's likely to change. I think they're probably going to look at that 15% reserve margin. That would be a natural place to look. Is that sufficient? Because that's really intended to deal with the unexpected. Loads, can pop up like they did during the heat wave. Mm-hmm. Also, supply can break, right? Generators can break. So that 15% reserve margin is intended to provide a safe cushion. I think they'll probably be taking a look at that. They may look again at some of the ratings on different types of generators. The renewables have taken big haircuts over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of what sort of net qualifying capacity that they're rated for, what the RA value is for solar
Mhm.
way back. They may take another look at that, and they may apply more stringent requirements on other types of resources as well.
Okay, so that leads me in my second question. Do you have any idea of what will, if we have to change our reserve margin, how that will affect us in the future?
Well, I don't think anything's going to happen for probably next year, but if the requirements did go up, then it would just mean we need more capacity relative to load, and so that's going to increase costs. It's going to increase costs for SDCP and SDG&E and everybody else. But that would be the result, is that we'd have to carry more capacity, a higher reserve margin, so we'd have higher power costs, generally speaking.
It'll be interesting to see. I think this is something that we need to work on our delegates up in Sacramento to find out where that's going to be, and if that's just going to be a 15% reserve margin is probably good 9 months out of the year, but there's a few months where it really needs to be looked at. So I wonder how that's going to go, and it might be something to put on our things as we're looking at as we move towards the future, and how that's going to play out, because something that we need to, I think, I'm not sure a one size fits all for the entire state is the right answer. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. And the other thing I think they'll look at that I forgot to mention, it would just be the load forecast itself, and how that's derived. And that's mostly done by the CEC. All the load serving entities prepare their own forecasts and provide those forecasts to the CEC, and then the CEC makes some adjustments. And so that's the agency that's really responsible for the official load forecast that's used for planning in the RA program. And there's decisions there that can be made about what type of weather scenario should you plan for, right? Load is so dependent on weather, and is it a 1 in 2 year type of a temperature type of an adjustment, or is it a 1 in 10 year, that type of thing. So and that's something that maybe could be done on a more geographic basis, as opposed to just a one size fits all reserve margin adjustment.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, John.
Okay, so if we could roll forward to the next slide. So I mentioned there's a local reliability obligation, and it just so happens that for SDCP and the San Diego load serving entities generally, that the vast majority of the RA obligation is local. So the vast majority of the capacity would have to be procured from resources within that San Diego, Imperial Valley area that's highlighted, southern portion of the map here. So that requirement, that local requirement, just the way the rules are set up, it's based on August peak loads. And so it's the same quantity every month of the year based on what the peak load forecast shows for August. And what that means for us is that we'll have this local obligation starting in January, even though load's not scheduled to be serving the phase 1 until March. This is something that we've known about and have been planning for, but it's a bit of a peculiarity in the system where even though we won't have any load, we do have an obligation starting January 1.
John, I have a question. The San Diego IV area designation, that's not all of the Imperial Valley. So does that not include IID? They're a fairly big load, but they're out there in a white area. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly what it means. It's not, these areas are defined by substations and transmission lines primarily, and not necessarily political boundaries. So yeah, it looks like that area is excluded.
But IID has substations and interconnects and lots of loads. So it's kind of interesting to me that they seem to have escaped some of this.
Well, it may be, since these are areas where CAISO is determined you need a certain amount of generation, in order to, maintain reliability. I don't know that much about IID, but, it just may be the case that they have plenty of generation relative to the loads in the local area.
Mm-hmm. Could be.
All right. So then, okay. So rolling on to then the compliance program. There's a year ahead and a month ahead process. So the year ahead is the one that we're talking about here. On October 31st. We need to show, we've already got our load forecast, our monthly peaks. That's all come back from the ultimately the CPUC. So October 31, we'll have to show that we have contracts in place to meet the year ahead obligations. And then there's also a monthly process that will actually start in November for January. That just continues. So every month there's going to be a filing starting in November for the basically 2 months forward. But the one we're focused on now is that year ahead filing. There is a penalty structure that's imposed if LSEs are deficient and don't meet all of their RA obligations. That's administered by the CPUC. There's also for local obligations, there is a waiver process, a waiver from the penalties if a load serving entity, certain conditions are met. They made good faith efforts, supply wasn't available, or it was at a extremely high price, a few other conditions. But there is a process as a backstop in case there's market power being exercised or just a insufficiency of supply. SDCP, we've been really active in procuring resource advocacy since starting in May, issued an RFO and have participated in RFOs run by, or an RFO run by San Diego Gas and Electric. So we've been actively procuring RA, and we do expect to be able to meet the RA obligations. Some of this is still in process, but we think we'll be able to get there. We're right now in discussions with SDG&E through their RFO process, and probably can't say too much about that, but that's an important process for us to meet these obligations.
Hey, John, before you move on, so is the RFO discussion, I know you can't go too much in detail, but is it looking more positive than it was a couple weeks back?
I think, yeah, I'm encouraged. So, I think, again, I do expect that we'll be able to get there. So, work in process, work in progress, but I'm encouraged at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Then this is a little more detail, maybe too much detail, but in terms of what we need to show October 31, it will be, again, this is for the local showing. We'll need to show that we have 100% of the obligation under contract for all months in 2021, all months in 2022, and then 50% of the obligations for all months in 2023. So it's really a 3-year obligation for local. For flexible, it's a 1-year obligation, but we'll need to show 100% of those obligations being met for all months in 2021. And then for the system obligation, which really is not much, as it turns out, for SDCP, but there's a requirement that we have 90% of those obligations under contract for the summer months. So that's the year ahead obligation. When we get into the month ahead, of course, that gets pushed up to 100%. So we have to have 100% of all the requirements in the month ahead time frame. As I mentioned, then that's the monthly process will start November 17th for January, and then we'll do another one December 18th for February, and so on and so on. All right. And then in terms of generator net qualifying capacity, different types of generators are rated, have different, what they call NQC ratings, net qualifying capacity ratings. And this is what you can use to meet your RA obligations. And so this is, percentages relative to the size of the project. So for a solar project, if you have a 100 megawatt solar project, you only get about 14 megawatts of resource adequacy value from that. Some of the more baseload technologies like biomass, geothermal, you get much closer to 100%. You get a much higher percentage of your capacity actually qualifies. And natural gas is pretty much 100% of the capacity that qualifies. So, as we're out trying to put a portfolio together for capacity, you really aren't able to do it with solar and wind. I mean, you would need 5 times the amounts. So you're really looking for these other technologies, and most of it's in natural gas, particularly in the local area. I think over time that can change, of course, particularly as storage starts to become more prevalent, and as SDCP may do some solar plus storage hybrid projects or standalone storage. I think that's a likely source of new capacity. But since we're looking at the next year or two, we pretty much need to buy with from the sources that already exist, right? We need to contract with generators that are already out there and running for the most part. Over time, I think there definitely is opportunity to change what that mix looks like, but not on day one.
Yeah, I think that's really important, John. I'm glad you actually say that, because we need to flip this. This needs to change. We need these other ones to go up and the other ones to go down. So yeah, I got you. Thank you, John, for highlighting that.
I think that's it for the overview, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Any more questions?
Chair Mira, I don't have any questions. I asked them during the presentation.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
All right, moving on to item 6, overview of upcoming energy contract agreements.
We're going to hand this over to Ryan, I believe. Ryan, are you ready for that?
Yes, here comes the more riveting portion of the presentation, energy contracts.
Can't wait. This is going to be, my enthusiastic level is way high right now, Ryan. Thank you.
Have an espresso, put it on mute, and sit back. Thank you, Ryan Barron, Best Krieger. I've been doing project development, regulations that affect projects most of my career, going back to 3rd and 4th generation wireless networks back in the early 2000s to energy projects. So I'm going to keep it very high level. There's probably, I could have put a 150-page contract up, but they don't even do that to you in law school. So if you do want to see what they look like, I can send them around. Do I have control here, or do I just say thanks? They say 90% of what a CCA does is buy things, right? Buy power. You're going to buy energy, brown power, green power, resource adequacy, which John just covered very well, and ancillary services, which is all the reliability services that load serving entities are responsible for to keep the grid maintained. So there's a lot of contracting that you're going to do. Next slide, please. This is going to come in 2 basic forms. When you look at contracts at local government, you have construction contracts, you have your run-of-the-mill procurement contracts for widgets or commodities, services agreements for labor and materials and consultants, real property agreements, real estate. The primary contract vehicle is, this is all commercial transactions. So it's going to be the master purchase, sorry, I put that wrong on the screen. It's master purchase and sale agreement, which you would see in a land deal. There's 2 trade associations, EEI and WSPP, that have developed templates for the industry to use. So folks like me don't have to reinvent the wheel, come up with a different contract for the same transaction over and over again. And they try to make it very easy for the industry to transact with the terms that buyers and sellers are used to seeing. And then those buyers and sellers do edit it up, but it cuts down on costs, attorney's fees, negotiations by using these. EEI is the standard one that most people use to contract power. WSPP is used a lot for RA, and you have to be a member of the trade association. I believe you join for $25,000 or something like that, and then you get to use their copyrighted agreement. And I'll go over what's in the types of contracts in just a second. But that's the master purchase and sale is sort of your standard buyer seller, looks at price, payment, default, indemnity, and then there'll be a cover sheet on there with your bank account information, your invoicing, and their check boxes. It makes it really easy to check off which terms apply, which person you contact in the event of a default, who you invoice, right on the cover, without having to go through the agreement and see in the back or in some notice section who that is. The one that this committee has been focusing on are power purchase agreements. Your power purchase agreements, think of these as your long-term agreements to buy green power, typically 10, 15, 20-year contracts. They're generally, they're commercial, but they're project development based. So you're going to commit to a developer to buy into their project at X amount of price at X amount of years. And then that gives them the security that they need to go back to their lenders, their tax equity and their equity investors to complete the project or to continue to operate it if the project's already existing. Whereas the master purchase and sale is like 30, 40 pages. These can be like 150 pages with exhibits. And these are going to contain all sorts of other stuff in addition to price and so forth. And so a lot of times you're negotiating with developers. And then you have confirmations. Confirmation agreements are basically one-page agreements. And they're going to be the master agreement that you buy power under is going to govern transactions with that entity. Say it's British Petroleum, who's a big seller to CCAs in the early years to get them up and running. BP or Next Era. You'll enter into this master agreement and you'll buy power through that agreement, but you're going to execute these one-page confirmations that have the transaction number, the type of transaction, the term, the delivery period, all sort of the nuts and bolts factual stuff that you're buying. And that's usually, the board, may not see those confirmations unless they're in long form. They may have already been delegated under the risk management policy or by the board, but the portfolio manager or the deputy or director in charge of procurement is executing those with the executive director. And you see those a lot in gas, right? Gas is very transactional. You have a master agreement and then you execute your gas purchases in these one-page confirmations. So short and long term are the major considerations here. You're going to have a number of counterparties that you're going to contract with, right? Maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 on the master purchase and sale side, a handful on the long term, which we're, negotiating now with a fairly longer list of shortlisted providers. And the one thing I like to do is look at it as a team approach, not just two lawyers negotiating in a room, but there's the commercial person, the business person, budget, and the lawyers negotiating another team, along with some folks that have some technical expertise in case those issues come up. Next slide, please. I like to think of these, and as a young age sitting across from developers and banks, that this is all just a form of risk allocation. Whether it's a price you're agreeing to, you are determining what amount of risk that you are taking on, whether it's price, term, what the product is, who the counterparty is, what their credit rating is, what the type of resource infrastructure, and then what comfort level you're with. And two parties then are trying to shift risk back and forth from one another. In the case of PPAs, it's often the developer trying to shift. The bank is shifting as much risk to that developer, who's trying to shift as much of that risk to you, and you're pushing back on both of them. And ultimately, what's ever pushed back on the developer is going to come out of their pocket with the bank with some other deal behind the scenes that you may not be privy to. So that's kind of the way I like to think of it, that never let anyone tell you that nothing is financeable. I think everything is. It's just a matter of who's going to pay for it. So in your power purchase agreement, this first bullet here, your basic terms are you're going to negotiate a price, what the term is. Let's say you're going to buy 19 months of brown power at $32 from Shell right out of the gate at 50 megawatts. What the delivery point is going to be, generally SP15 on your PPAs, it might be at the node. Are there credit and collateral terms involved? Do they want you to post a letter of credit equal to 1 or 2 years of the notional value of the contract? What happens in the event of default? Well, failure to pay in 3 or 5 business days, breaching a material covenant, going bankrupt. Maybe it's defaulting, what's called cross default, defaulting on your agreement with River City Bank because there's a block box issue, which then threatens payment to the counterparty. So there can be certain cross defaults, indemnities, etc. So they're pretty straightforward. They're fairly long agreements, but they are fairly straightforward once you get a handle with the mechanics. Your PPAs are going to have a lot of those same nuts and bolts items, but they're looking at things long term. And so you're really focusing on not only an exchange of financials and who your counterparty is, but when are they going to deliver construction? When's the construction of the facility going to start? Are they going to pay penalties if construction doesn't start by a certain time? There's generally commercial operation milestones in place where there's an expected commercial operation date and a guaranteed date, and then perform development securities that are paid for or that you can draw on if they don't hit those, because they're going to threaten your procurement or your regulatory obligations. For instance, if you're buying capacity or ancillary services as part of that transaction. Development and performance securities are heavily negotiated in terms of what the developer has to pay. Can they post in the form of a surety bond, a letter of credit? And then some other things might be important to the seller. What is the performance guarantee that comes with a solar project? You'll be fighting over 95% versus 90%. We've gotten recent pushback on storage charging capacity. They didn't want to put a charging capacity. I'm not saying in this, under another client's negotiation. They didn't want to put a charging capacity amount, just wanted us to pay based on what came over the meter. What if their compliance costs go up? What if there's a decision by the CAISO or the PUC that now causes more costs on the project? There's usually a provision that talks about how the parties will deal with those costs. So those are all sort of unique items to a PPA. Next slide. And lastly, what's the process coming through the committee and coming to the board? On the master purchase and sale agreements, we call it an enabling process. Parties will negotiate the master agreement, even though we don't have a specific transaction in mind or an RFO. You'll get those in place. Oftentimes, I recommend bringing them to the board. I usually like to recommend bringing a template to the board that then is delegated to the executive director to execute. So we're not redacting contracts and bringing individual redacted contracts to the board every time. You can also contract bilaterally. So if some clients need a little sliver of RPS, they have an entity in mind and a good price, they'll basically do a bilateral deal in the local government world that's sole source, and they'll buy a little sliver of something to feed the portfolio. Most of it's done through your request for offer process. And of course, a lot of the agreements are going to the board subject to your risk management policy, which has delegations to the CEO based on tenor limit, volumetric limit, and notional value. So basically term, volume, price, and then staff can approve the confirmations. What we try to avoid when these contracts come up is discussing some of the confidential terms. The price, term, location, certain resource types are all confidential under the PUC rules, up to 3 years. Now, we don't have a clean exception in the Public Records Act for them, so we rely on the PUC rules. We've identified a few exceptions that apply, and generally, if there's a PRA request, we redact those and then give them out to the public. But we generally try and send over confidential memos on those terms if the committee is interested in seeing prices outside of the ad hoc process, or if the board is going to approve a project. It will generally know ahead of time that those commercial terms will be redacted by law. And that's also to protect against market sensitive information being distributed which was post energy crisis. Those rules came about. So I think that's my last slide.
Hey, Ryan, I got
yeah.
a question for you, brother.
Yep.
Could you, so board adopts agreements, shouldn't it be, it comes to the committee makes a recommendation and then the board adopts the agreements?
Yes.
Okay, maybe we should just, because if you bring this up, I just think it'd be nice for the board. The board doesn't know that quite yet. So it'd be nice if we put that step in here so they're crystal clear when we bring this to the next board meeting.
I'll revise this slide with the steps. I didn't base it on the risk management policy. I should have done that, but I'll revise that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions, Director West?
None.
Thank you very much for that, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Very, very intriguing stuff. Very important behind the scenes stuff.
Yes, that's right.
All right. That brings us to item 7, committee member announcements. Yes, Director West.
I just want us to take a moment of silence and hearken back to my high school roots and with the passing of Eddie Van Halen today.
Let's go ahead and do that. With
Thank you,
that,
Chair.
you're welcome. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Good night.